And so different than the Roman Empire, different than the Constantinian Empire, and then also different than the rule of Charlemagne. It is this name, Holy Roman Empire, that will last, at least in name, until the 1800s. So we're talking about almost 1,000 years that the Holy Roman Empire was in existence. Eventually, Otto's son, Otto II, will be called Roman Emperor. And previously it had been Emperor, King of the Germans, King of the Franks, those kind of things. This, of course, angers the Byzantine Emperor, who thinks he is the Roman Emperor because of how long the Byzantine Empire extends back to the time of Constantine. Otto expects the bishops, even the Pope, to obey him. And if you disagree with him, he would kick you out of office. Eventually, this would get to the point where John the 12th is very fearful of Otto's power. And Otto will eventually depose the very Pope who crowned him emperor. After the death of Otto II, Otto III would succeed him, but he is only 3 years old. And so there are power struggles until he is old enough to rule. But he still dies very young, and so his cousin Henry will become the emperor. Henry dies childless without a successor, and this should say Henry III, not Henry II. I apologize for that. And so Henry II dies without a successor, and the dukes and the nobles decide, let's elect somebody else from a different region than Saxony. And so they elect no, that is supposed to be Henry II, because Henry III is the first of the Franconian rulers. So Henry II takes over after Otto III. He dies childless as well, and then the Franconians, which come from a different region in modern Germany, come to power in the 11th century. Henry III is not technically emperor. He referred to himself as the king of the Romans rather than the king of the Germans, though. The Franconians as well have this idea that the emperor, the supreme ruler, should control the church, even to the point of deciding who the pope should be. Although the emperors are also crowned by the pope, right? So there's this kind of, well, we should choose who the pope is going to be, but the pope is the one who decides who the emperor is going to be, and whether a ruler is an emperor or not. But there's still this power struggle. Henry III, for example, will remove 3 popes during his time and reseat new popes for them. So what power does the emperor have? What power does the pope have? And this struggle between the two continues throughout this entire period. And one of those things can be seen in the relationships between a pope named Gregory VII and another pope named another emperor named Henry IV. So during this time, the pope would come into conflict sometimes with the Western emperor, but then sometimes in the Eastern emperor. So there's kind of this, the pope is upsetting both emperors. A lot of this is reflected in a document published in 1075 known as Dictatus Papae. Essentially, it's a list of statements that are entered into the register of the Pope's letters, Gregory VII, that gives a statement of the powers of the Pope. Ferguson provides a selection in his textbook of some of those. It's 27 statements, and he provides some selection of those. But essentially, within that document are some religious powers for the Pope and political powers as well. Religious powers like who can appoint and depose bishops, right? So who can put them in the power, who can take them out, the Pope. that the authority of papal representatives are greater than that of the bishops. So even if the Pope sends a priest to a bishop, right, even though the bishop is above the priest, because this priest comes from the Pope, he is of higher status than the bishop. Right? So representatives of the Pope have power as well. Now, there is a question of who can call synods and councils, these gatherings of bishops, and he allows that some bishops might call a council, but only when the Pope calls the council can it be considered a general council. The political powers of the Pope included the claim that princes should kiss the feet of the Pope, and that he had the power to depose emperors. So if he didn't like the way the emperor was going, he could get rid of the emperor as well. One major area of conflict was over the issue of investiture. Essentially, this means who has the right, who has the authority to ordain individuals to religious office. And so for some time, up till the middle of the 11th century, nobility had been the ones to appoint or invest bishops to local cities, abbots and monasteries. That makes a lot of sense in one scheme because these are the people that are in control of this land. And largely at various times this occurred with little notice. But it did have an important consequence. Bishops, especially, were often lords, essentially, over prosperous lands. So the nobles would often sell the bishopric, right, the office of bishop, to people they believed would be loyal. A practice known, as we talked about it before, as simony, after Simon the sorcerer. And it was something that, although condemned, still took place, because it was such a authoritative position. Essentially, bishops were princes of the empire. And so the political power, the religious power, the physical lands that you control, the wealth that was coming in all of this, was a monumental task or a monumental position. And one that for many centuries was in the control of local lords. In 1054, a pope who we'll talk about more on Thursday, named Leo IX, who had been very interested in the need for reform in the church, died. The question arose, who has the right to decide who the new pope should be? If there's an emperor, should the emperor make that decision? Should the religious leaders make that decision? Eventually, the decision was that the Romans would elect a pope, but he must be from Germany. Right? And so the Romans would elect him, but it had to be somebody who was German. So a delegation appealed to the emperor, Henry III, for suggestions regarding the new pope. Who did he think would be a good candidate? And so he suggests one of his relatives, who becomes Victor II, Pope Victor II. Victor is very influential in helping Henry, effectively squashing a rebellion that had developed against Henry. And because of this, the emperor asks him to take charge of his son, to raise his son. Essentially putting Victor in control of both worlds. All right? He's pope, but now he's also overseeing the education, discipline, etc. of the successor to the empire. After Victor's death, Victor had kind of been a reforming pope, not as major as Leo the Ninth had been. After him, there are some good popes, some reformer popes, but then there's this terrible pope. And people start getting concerned about the papacy again. And so church leaders are really concerned about who should be making these decisions about who gets this power. In the year 1056, Henry III dies, and Henry IV becomes king. He's 6 years old. Some reformers in the church decide this is a perfect time to try and take power back from the emperor for us. And so a church council decides that the pope should be determined by the College of Cardinals. Cardinals were kind of a higher level of church official, close advisors to the pope, much fewer in number, but their assembly would be the one who would determine who the new pope would be. And that's the way it continues down today. When Francis I was selected as pope, he was selected by the College of Cardinals. Eventually, a man named Hildebrand is elected as Pope Gregory VII. This is a few years down the line. He had been one of the religious leaders who had approached Henry III for suggestions on the new pope when Victor II had been selected. When Hildebrand becomes Gregory VII, he feels that Henry IV, who is now older, ranges into his young adulthood at this point, feels that Henry would be relatively supportive. But now that Henry is a full-fledged emperor, and he's ruling on his own, he has a different perspective, and feels that the clergy, particularly the bishops, are becoming too powerful. And so he wants to take some of that power back, and believes and claims that it is the emperor who should invest religious leaders with their office. That it was essentially his divine right as the anointed emperor. With the release of Dictatus Papae, however, the church had essentially said that only the Pope could determine who would be the bishop. Anyone who was invested by a common person, what was known as lay investiture, would be excommunicated. So you could find yourself as bishop because the king or a local lord had made you bishop, but if the Pope had not approved it, you would be kicked out of the church. Henry, however, decides he's going to continue to appoint bishops himself. Now, he has the support of the German bishops, because that is predominantly where the rule is coming from at this time in the empire, is the German areas where he is living. The German bishops support Henry because he had been responsible for their selection as bishops. Right? No surprise. What turns around on this is the claim that, right, as Gregory VII begins to claim that these bishops are not truly bishops, Henry and his supporters will claim that Gregory is not a true pope. Well, that does not sit well with Gregory. Gregory calls for Henry to appear before him or face condemnation and deposition, meaning he's going to be in trouble with the church and he's going to lose his power as emperor. Henry ignores the calls and instead calls a council and deposes Gregory from being pope. He will write to the Pope beginning this way, letting him know about this council. Henry, king, not by usurpation, but by the holy ordinance of God, to Hildebrand, not now pope, but a false monk. Right? And so he uses his birth name, as opposed to what has begun to happen with popes, and they are taking a new name once they become pope. So, born Hildebrand comes Gregory VII. Gregory's advisors say to him, you have to take control of this situation. And so he excommunicates Henry and deposes him from being emperor. Henry has his bishops excommunicate Gregory. Things seem to be relatively good for Henry, but his support starts to fade away. I mean, when you think about it, hey, the Pope has just excommunicated you. Has kicked you out of the church. I don't know that that's the person whose side we want to be on. Right? And so the Pope starts to see some of these people siding with him. So Henry decides he will appeal to Gregory for mercy. But he does so privately. He doesn't want it to be a public matter. Henry decides he will go to see Gregory. And they are to meet in an old castle. Henry wants a private interview, but Gregory insists, no, this is a public matter and must be a public interview. According to the tradition, the stories of the time, Henry will wait for 3 days in order to get an audience with the Pope, dressed as a penitent, right, that he's undergoing church penance, and will do so in very cold weather in the snow. Because of this, Gregory feels, I've got to forgive him, right? He's publicly identifying himself as penitent. He's waiting for this. And so Gregory forgives Henry, welcomes him back into the church. Henry goes back to Germany where he faces civil war. Gregory doesn't intercede. It doesn't get in on it and say, Henry's the rightful ruler, you need to follow him. Just kind of stays back. Henry goes back to appointing bishops again. Right? So he's been excommunicated, brought back into the favor of the church, goes back, starts appointing bishops again. Gregory excommunicates him again. This time, however, things go differently. Henry wins the war. Once again has the favor of the people and the bishops, and so through them, he elects a rival pope, what are often referred to as anti-popes. And so the history of the papacy includes several people who are called anti-popes. Recognize that people appointed them as pope, but they are not in the true apostolic succession line. This pope, this anti-pope, will make Henry the emperor. And he's just been kind of king of the Germans, but now he is made emperor by this anti-pope. Henry decides he is going to march on Rome and remove Gregory. Gregory appeals to the Normans for help. He appeals to the east, to the Byzantine Empire, but ultimately he will have to flee. Because here he is in Rome, and the Romans particularly don't like the Normans, and so the Normans coming into their territory is not a good thing, and so Gregory loses a lot of support quickly. He will leave Rome and die in exile. However, that doesn't end the situation, because Henry will then have struggles with his anti-pope that he has set up, and the tensions will continue. His son Henry V, however, supports the papacy and will actually make his father renounce his anti-pope in order to kind of restore the line of the papacy. But Henry V, when he becomes king, will actually set up his own anti-pope. And so there's, again, all this back and forth, and it becomes very, very unclear. He will eventually give up some of his rights as ruler and be welcomed back as a faithful Catholic. The line of the empire will continue through the Franconians, eventually going to the Hohenstaufen and later the Habsburgs. So it'll kind of shift around through various families and tribes or regions in what is modern-day Germany.